I like to begin all our programs by acknowledging that we're here on Indigenous land. This acknowledgement is important to me for a couple of reasons. First, I want to acknowledge the ancestral and ongoing relationship between the plants and animals and land and the people who are of this place that we now call Portland. And then I also want to recognize the sovereignty of the hundreds of tribes and nations who now exist within the United States, and many of whose citizens have made their homes here in Portland. The mission of the Oregon Historical Society is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the peoples, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. So we do this work in a lot of different ways. Obviously, our museum here in downtown Portland, and we've got exhibits on all 3 floors. This program that we have tonight is part of a year-long series that is in honor of a new permanent exhibit that we opened earlier this year. It's called Experience Oregon, and it's this way up on the 3rd floor. We spent a lot of time working on this exhibit and making sure that it told a different kind of Oregon story than we've told here at the Oregon Historical Society before. And we wanted this story to be one that was more complicated and included the perspectives of a diversity of peoples that we had not included in exhibits before. So we encourage you all to come and take a look at the exhibit and spend some time there and let us know how we did. This program, like the others in this series, will be recorded and made available on our website and our YouTube channel. So you can go back and check it out again and again. The other work that we do here is, of course, online. The Oregon Encyclopedia and the Oregon History Project are authoritative resources about Oregon history that you can turn to from anywhere in the world. Our digital collections website is relatively new and growing every day. You can access oral histories, photographs, and documents on digitalcollections.ohs.org. Obviously, we do a lot of public programs like this one here and in other places in Portland and around the state. Our journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, has been published continuously for 120 years and is a wealth of information and perspective and knowledge about Oregon history. Our research library is open to the public 32 hours a week. It's free of charge, no appointment necessary. Come on in and find out all kinds of interesting artifacts and documents from the past that maybe can tell you about your home or your community or your family. We really encourage you to use the research library. And of course, we have a lot of programs for school groups. We have tours who come in for no charge, and we send traveling trunks out around the state on a variety of different topics. So take advantage of all we have to offer. We really encourage that. And we do, of course, want to appreciate and thank all of the people who make our work possible. OHS members and volunteers, thank you so much. Also, there are many foundations and corporations and individuals who sponsor our work. We're grateful of that. Multnomah County residents have twice voted to enact a modest property tax levy that supports the Oregon Historical Society and 4 historical societies in East Multnomah County. We're incredibly grateful for that support, and Multnomah County residents, please keep in mind that admission to the Oregon Historical Society is always free for you, and there are discounts on membership for Multnomah County residents. So we really encourage you to take advantage of that, and thanks very much for the support. I'm really excited for tonight's program to see what our speaker has in store from us. He's a person with a wealth of knowledge, not only about Oregon history, but about the history of the globe. And I think we're very excited to have him here. His bio says that he is Professor Emeritus at Portland Community College. He was the instructor of several U.S. history courses and currently teaches the history of Africa, as well as a class entitled Race and Racism, which is presented from a global perspective. He is the historian of record for the annual Vanport Mosaic Festival and is currently researching and writing a full-length account of Vanport City. But I also want to add to that he is a wonderful advisor to many projects here at the Oregon Historical Society. He serves on the editorial advisory board for the Oregon Encyclopedia, and he has advised us on other kinds of projects that we do here on an ad hoc basis, and is just a tremendous friend and I was going to say confidant, but really just a tremendous teacher to us here at OHS. And so we're very grateful for all of the ways that he teaches us and advises us. So please join me in welcoming Mr. James Stanley Harrison.
Good evening. It's good to see all of you. Thank you very much for coming. This is June 19th, Juneteenth, which is a celebration that began in Texas, Galveston, Texas, when the U.S. Army rode in and informed the slaves living there that they were now free. And it also informed them that they were equal to anybody else in the country. Not so. It took a couple of 100 years and more in order to achieve that. But that was the ideal. And my talk tonight is about the ideal of the United States and getting to that ideal. I think we've gone a long way toward it, but we're not there yet. Before I begin, I want to take a couple of minutes in silence, not for anyone, but for you. And the silence is that I want you to talk to one, maybe two people who you don't know. And do an exercise that I call the double O. What is your origin? And what is or was or will be your occupation? So if you take a couple of minutes to get to know a couple of people who are here for perhaps the same reason you're here, but an interest in this subject. So I'll be quiet for about 2 minutes, and you talk. Okay, thank you very much. We can get started in just a short while. So the catchword for my talk catchword for my talk is the enigma of black history in Oregon. And the term enigma is a 17th century term, and it refers to a person or situation that's difficult to understand. And so I'm going to talk about that by going through not the entire history, of course, but just a few things to bring that out a little bit more. But before that, like Eliza, I'd like to acknowledge the ground that we stand upon, a number of different groups, and we are part of that. One of the things I like about history is that, as Faulkner said, the past is not really the past. It's right here. And I'd like to just say something personal about my contact with history. I love being in contact with history. In 1995, our family took a heritage tour to visit my wife's background, which is partly Tahlequah, Oklahoma, Cherokee, and my own in South Carolina. And we went to Washington, D.C., where I walked in Williamsburg, the same place that Thomas Jefferson walked. I went to Jamestown and went to the church that Pocahontas was married in. And I love the history of a place because things are not too far from me. The past is not the past. I do know from my mother that my great-grandfather was a slave. And when I went to school in South Carolina in the 1950s, it was during the age of segregation, which is a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight in Oregon. And I remember one thing very clearly. I was 5 years old, and I got my first pair of shoes. Before that, I did something called barefooting. But to go to school, and seriously, I had to walk 1 mile. There was no snow. There was frost in December sometimes. But one day in the first grade, I remember we were doing counting, learning our numbers and letters. And of course, everybody knows A, B, C. But numbers were really fascinating. And I sometimes ask myself, why do I number things today and I count today? And I think it's because when I first learned numbers, learning how to count is really exciting. 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 10. And then I remember walking home one day. Normally it's my brother and cousins. We had a whole bunch of cousins. Harrison's probably took up about a quarter of the class that I was in. But I remember walking home and counting and just walking and saying, and a 1, and a 2. And I kept going all the way up to 100. Yeah, that was the biggest number there was, 100. So I kept this in mind, and something came to me when I was teaching Black American history at PCC about 20 years ago. It occurred to me that one Sunday, standing outside of church, and the AME church, if you've ever been there, is really church. You go in the morning, you stay for lunch, and you go in the afternoon. So during the lunch break, I was standing next to a tree, and I heard this old couple speaking. And I remember exactly what he said because of the number involved. He said, "So, old lady, how old are you?" And she said, "I's 103. If you know the Little Rascals, I did a stymie. Remember, 100 was the biggest number ever. And he clapped his hands, and he said, "I gotcha. I's 105. Another stymie." Now that I remembered, but 20 years ago, I'm teaching history, and it suddenly occurred to me, if you subtract 100 from 1951, you get to 1851. When I was a 5-year-old kid, I met 2 slaves. And I know that my grandfather, great-grandfather, was a slave. And so history is never too far from me. And whenever I go to a place, I try to absorb that history, as I am trying to continue to do with Oregon. And I would, as Eliza mentioned, the ground that we stand on, we need to keep that in mind, that it's somebody else's, but we are now part of it. So, with that, I'd like to reflect on what America means, but I want to begin with a metaphor. There was a young reporter looking for a story, and she was walking around town and saw this guy slapping mortar and bricks. It was a hot day, and so she went to him and said, "Sir, what are you doing?" He looked up at her with this quizzical look. "What do you mean, what am I doing?" He said, "I'm stacking bricks." "Thank you." And she walked on. A little bit further, she encountered someone else doing the exact same thing. And she asked again, "What are you doing?" He wiped the sweat off his brow, looked up at her, smiled, and said, "I'm building a university." Both doing the same thing, but they had different visions of what they were doing. And I think we do sometimes. And so I'd like to encourage you to think a little bit beyond what you have done and what you are doing. For example, a TriMet bus driver might say, I drive a TriMet bus. Or they might say, I take teenagers to school so they can get education. I take people to a store so they can buy things. I take ill people to the hospital or to a doctor. It takes it to a different level. Or somebody working at Fred Meyer or Safeway could say, I'm a clerk. Or they could say, I facilitate people getting groceries for sustenance so that they can be healthier. It's always possible to think a little bit higher. And I believe that that is what the people that I'm going to talk with you about have been doing, thinking a little bit higher, not the mundane, but a little bit higher. So, Langston Hughes, who's one of my favorites, by the way, once wrote about America. And part of his poem was, let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. And then in parentheses, America never was America to me. America never was America to me. So what is America? What is Oregon? I'd like to explore that with you. The first people of African descent to arrive in Oregon was most likely a man named Marcus Lopez. He was from Africa, the Cape Verde Islands off West Africa, and he sailed on a ship with Captain Gray. It's called the Lady Washington. They landed in 1787. His story is not a very sad one because he violated a few cultural rules and died. About 17 years later, the Corps of Discovery came through. We call it the Lewis and Clark Expedition sometimes. Among the 40-plus people who were there, one woman, one baby, and one black man, Sakakawea and York. And there's an image of York, by the way, outside. Oftentimes it seems that York is a forgotten person. He was William Clark's slave. But the question is, why was York chosen for this journey? After all, both Lewis and Clark chose people that they thought were very needful, that they needed. And York was such a person. He grew up with Clark as friends until probably about age 10 when they separated into, I'm the master, you're the slave. But York, by the way, was a very big man. He was about 6'2". He was the biggest man on the journey, very strong, very gregarious, and a hunter. In fact, I tell you about, I like walking in history. I dragged my wife down to the coast, Astoria, and about 3 or 4 miles east of the coast, there's a little creek. And at the creek, there's a little stand that says, this is where York did some hunting. So I went there, and I went down to the stream and went over and pretended to be York for about 5 minutes until my wife said it's time to go. But why York? Why was he important? He was a very intelligent person. He was very good with a gun. He could also do something that many people could not do, those in the Corps of Discovery. He could swim. In fact, one of the things he did was he saved lives, and he saved some of the documents that we know. So he was very important. In addition, his skin color was quite different, and so he was a fascinating individual. In one particular instance, in their winter stay, when they came in, some of the Indians, the Mandan Indians, looked at him and thought, this must be a great man, because when a hunter goes out with the Mandan and they've been successful at killing an animal, which will help feed the village, they paint their faces black. So here's a guy who's not only his face, but his entire body. And they thought, well, he's got to be something. Another example, though, is another group where when you paint your face black, it means that you want to make war. It took a little while, but because he's such a gregarious person, they soon figured out, okay, this is not a war party. York was important in that instance. York and Sacagawea were allowed to vote with the party in terms of where do we stay, in Washington or in Oregon. They got to vote. Now, here is the enigma. After 2 years, he goes back and he is once again a slave. Now, the other 40 men got back pay for 2 years. They also got land, which was typical for soldiers, and they were soldiers. York expected to get freedom. He didn't, at least not right away. So here's the enigma. Realizing that he might not become free, why didn't York just walk away? Many times, as I said, near Astoria, he was by himself hunting for the group. Why didn't he just walk away and say, I'm free? I believe it's because the man had integrity. He also had a wife back home. So family values as well. And that's, to me, something that York adds to the Oregon story. When I first moved to Oregon, I lived in the Northwest. Somebody told me, go there because you'll find cheap apartments at that time, 1970s. They also said the further away you get from Burnside in this alphabet area, the cheaper they are. So I started walking, Burnside, Cooch, Davis. I got to Marshall, and I found a nice apartment. But I also knew if I continued on, I would reach York. Several years ago, York Street, which probably was named for the British city of York, was dedicated to York the Explorer. So we have, if you've ever been to York, it's part of the industrial district, it's named after him. And I think that's an important part of his legacy in Oregon. So another question, and why I asked you to talk about your origin, why did you come to Oregon if you weren't born here? Why did black people come to Oregon, of all places? A place that did not want black people at all, slaves or free. And I think the reason is why a lot of us, myself included, have come. Could be family, friends, an occupation, wanderlust, for a variety of reasons. But black people stayed here and endured some indignities, but continued on. And I think that's another very important part of the story. After the Civil War, things were supposed to have been different. There were 3 amendments passed, 13, 14, 15, freeing slaves, providing with rights, providing with the vote, except in Oregon. And that is where we come to the story of people fighting against the status quo, fighting to change things in Oregon. And again, lifting it up, the fight was not just for black people. In 1913, when, led by blacks, There are delegations that went to Salem to try to get rid of antiquated laws that no longer had an effect because of those 3 amendments. Blacks said, we want to make things better for blacks, for American Indians, and for Asians. So it's not just for one particular group of people. And my contention is that what blacks did in changing the laws in Oregon was to uplift all people. They saw themselves as doing something for humanity, not just for a particular group. And one of those who was very important was a man named the Novel Unthinking. He's also memorialized in Portland because there's a park named after him. He arrived in 1929 as the only black physician in Oregon. Why? Because blacks worked on the railroads, and hospitals and so forth would be very reluctant to accept the black patient. And so doctors made house calls, including Dr. Unthank. But what he thought was, I'm a doctor, I'm professional. He graduated, by the way, Howard University School of Medicine. And he chose a place to live, a place where a professional would be very proud of. And it was in Southeast Portland. There were no blacks on his block, and his neighbors greeted him. In fact, after he moved in, they went up to him with a big note that said, here, we've all signed it, we want you to leave. And he declined. So they broke every window on the first floor, and he declined. They threw garbage on his lawn, and he declined. They killed a cat, at which point he decided, I'm out of here. He had to move 3 times before he found a place where his white neighbors would accept him. He also became a member of the NAACP. He provided medical care for blacks, for Asians, for whites. And because of his attitude, he became the first black member of the City Club. And as the first black member of the City Club, he pushed them to write a paper. And if you're familiar with the City Club, I'll step aside for a second. The City Club has a new paper about Portland's government. If you haven't read it, you might want to read it. It's asking that we change from what I believe is an outdated commission form of government. But they have pushed for a lot of things. And based on Dr. Unthank's membership, they wrote in 1945 a paper about the Negro in Portland, which alerted a lot of people who did not know that there are a lot of problems. Because if you're unaware of the problem, there's no need for a solution. And so that is one of the things that Dr. Unthank did. He was also related to a couple of other things that I'll get to. One is a place called Vanport, where he became the doctor of record. When I was teaching at PCC full-time, I had a number of people, when I'm talking about Dr. Unthank, they say, oh, he birthed me. He probably birthed half the black people in the city of Portland at one time. But his standing increased because of that, and he began to form alliances, which were very helpful. And that alliance also went up to 1953, which is another landmark public accommodations law, which I'll also get to in a short while. Another activist was a woman named Beatrice Morrow Kennedy. And she arrived in Portland in 1912. Very, very interesting backstory. She's from a small town in Texas that was an all-black town. And so she was used to black people being in authority. And her demeanor, all of her brothers and sisters, by the way, I believe there's 6 or 7 of them, all went to college. And so, and she went to Chicago to go to college, and then started a correspondence with this guy named E.D. Kennedy. Now imagine this. You're in your 20s, and you start writing this person who's about 15, 20 years older, and sight unseen, you decide through correspondence that you're going to get married, which is what happened. She took a train from Chicago to Portland, got married. Now, E.D. Kennedy was also an activist. He was related to a couple of ventures in Portland, one of which was a newspaper called The Advocate. And it came out at times, it was the only black paper in Oregon, and sometimes in Oregon and Washington. And his partners fell away. There were, I think, 4 of them who started it, and they fell away. So he was doing all the printing. When his wife came, she became the assistant editor. She also became the main writer and printer and publicist and getting advertisers as well. So we can say that beginning about 1913, she was the advocate, and she was an advocate. She used the paper, as many black papers, to write about success stories of black people, to encourage it, and also deliberately to tear down any kind of prejudice and discrimination. She was also very happy that from time to time the Oregonian would print articles, reprint articles, or ask her to print articles. By the 1930s, she was a very, very powerful force. But one of the things that led to it was that she too formed or helped create an organization called the NAACP, the first one in the Northwest. And a year after this happened, this was 1914, the world is at war, a very nefarious film came out called Birth of a Nation. It should have been called The Birth of the Klan, based on a book by a man named Dixon called The Klansman, which we have in the PCC library. It's called a romance. That's a 19th century term. But it glorifies the Klan. And the NAACP nationwide decided that this movie should not be shown. It was a time when movies had to be approved by local film boards. And so Mrs. Kennedy and others went to the Portland City Council and the film board and asked them to ban the film. If you've never seen the film, you can see it on YouTube, Birth of a Nation. It is one of the most racist films that has ever come out. It was, by the way, the first full-length film that all kinds of, I think it's a wonderful film in how it's put together, but I think it's a terrible film in the message that it had. And so she led a protest against that film. Certain parts were cut out, and I mean literally cut out. Using a scissors, they would cut out parts, show the film, and then go to another town and tape it back together. For the next 15 years, Birth of a Nation came back several times, and each time it was protested. And each time they made some cuts, but they showed the film. Now, this activism in 1915 continued on because the result of that picture in Atlanta sparked a new Ku Klux Klan, which came to Oregon. And the 1920s was very, very powerful, and they also had a powerful person writing and speaking out against them. She spoke, by the way, at a variety of places. She spoke at the University of Portland. at Lincoln High School, the old Lincoln High School, which is now part of Portland State. She went to Bend, Oregon, and spoke there. And students wrote her and thanked her for coming, and she wrote them back. She was very good with her correspondence. In the 1920s, Vernonia was a big logging town, and they brought in a number of black loggers from the South. The town fathers there decided that black kids could not go to school. And so who went out there to try to persuade them? Bernice Morrow Kennedy. And she had a rip-roaring fight with the editor of the local paper, and I think she bested him. And eventually, the school board decided that, yes, Negro children, colored children, could go to school there. Now, this victory came at a cost because, unfortunately, there's still latent sexism going around, and here she was, not the president of the NAACP, but she was the most well-known person. And people would come to her for advice. The mayor, by the way, was one of the subscribers of The Advocate. The Advocate had about 3,000 subscribers. When she arrived, there were only about 1,000 blacks in Portland. So most of the subscribers were whites who wanted to find out what this lady is talking about. And so she used that very, very powerful instrument. She also decided that writing was good, giving speeches was good, but something that later becomes a philosophy. She invited people to her house for tea. She had what were called interracial teas. She invited black women, white women, Asian women, and they dressed up in their fanciest, and they went to her house for tea and conversation. And she made sure that she greeted everyone, and if you were talking to the same person you talked to the last time, she'd say, oh, let me introduce you to someone else. In the 1950s, this was dubbed the contact theory, that you get people together of different ethnic groups and it breaks down barriers. She was doing it before the theory was developed. And she was very, very popular. One other thing she did was she went to law school. Unfortunately, she didn't pass the bar, but that did not stop her from practicing. She was won several times and then decided, okay, I'm not going to practice. But she did graduate, and she did practice and help people. At about that time, she divorced. I tell you that she'd married a man who was about 15 years older than her. She divorced and then married a man who was about 15 years younger than her. Following which, she left and went to California to be closer to her 2 adult sons. And so she disappears from Oregon, but she continues on as a teacher in Los Angeles. So, 1930s, things were looking bad in the country, the Depression, people losing jobs. And then, December 7th, 1941, there is an attack on China, the Philippines, and the American colony of Hawaii, all on the same day by the Japanese. It draws us into war, and it makes Portland an important city for shipbuilding. The Kaiser Company had opened a shipyard earlier to provide ships for the British, who were losing a lot to the submarine warfare. And so it then becomes important for the U.S. to have merchant ships, to have aircraft carriers, to have tankers, and later on to have landing vessels. And so Mr. Kaiser opened several shipyards. What he needed were people. And so he recruited nationwide. And this is a very important part of the story because in 1940, the census in Portland, Oregon showed that there were 1,931 black people. 1944, the estimate is over 20,000, from less than 1%. And there were only two places that they could live in terms of federal housing, a place called Vanport and a place called Giles Lake. And because, again, 1%, less than 1%, when Vanport opened, about 7% of the population was black, coming from New York, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Kansas. And many of those who came, as I said, what is your origin? Why did you come here? Many of those who came thought things would be different. They're going to the north. But as someone poignantly said, Portland is a northern city with a southern viewpoint. And so they were very disappointed. But they challenged the way things were. Blacks trained for certain jobs in making ships. They qualified for them, and when they got there, they were given lesser jobs. And so there's an organization, the Shipyard Negro Organization for Victory, to fight against the union that basically excluded blacks. And it is that massive number of blacks who came and stayed. About half of the blacks who came to Oregon during the 1940s stayed on. And they provided a crucial amount of folks to bring about changes. One thing that I found that in doing some research, by the way, is that there was a SemiPro Baseball team in Portland because of Vanport called the Rose. And it was short-lived. I think it lasted for one season. And they played at what was called Multnomah Stadium along with, I can't remember if it was the Beavers. I think it was the Beavers. And so they played when the Beavers were not there. One of the owners of that, and there was, I believe, either 7 or 8 on the West Coast, one of the owners was a guy named Jesse Owens, who actually did come to Portland. I don't know where he stood, but he did come to Portland. Other things that Vanport did or created was a change in atmosphere. Not only were blacks more visible, but one person, a man named James T. Hamilton, superintendent of schools, made sure that even though we're living in the age of segregation, that where he could, he would employ Dewey's theory of democracy. Vanport was a segregated area. Many people, and there's so much misinformation about Vanport that I've seen. For example, Vanport was half black. No. Vanport was 40% black. No. There are figures. Initially 7%, at the very end, close to about 25%. But 25% compared to less than 1% before is very alarming, especially when you have a racist mayor named Riley, who did not, in fact, the whole Portland establishment did not want outsiders coming in, period. No black people, no poor people. One people, by the way, one group of people who they really did not like were those Italians from Brooklyn, because you know they're all thugs. And there was a fear that they would bring their thuggery to Portland and change it forever. James Hamilton, in the half of Vanport, where you had 3 segregated groups of apartments for blacks only, made sure that in that particular school area, the schools were integrated. That's in the West. In the East, the housing authority basically said it's all white, and so he could do nothing there. But where blacks lived, an example, if there were 10 black kids in the 5th grade, he put them into different classrooms, not linking them all together. He got some complaints from some Southern whites. And by the way, Southern blacks were not used to this either. They thought it was strange because they were used to sitting next to all black people and having black teachers. And here they are in this strange land, and now they're sitting next to white students. Some of the white students didn't like it either, but the parents were the ones who did not like it the most. And Superintendent Hamilton would tell them, well, you know what, from time to time we do change children around. So they were mollified. Now, he never did it, but they were mollified. They thought that's okay. Vanport hired the first black teachers. Vanport hired the first black librarians, the first black sheriff deputies. There was in Portland, I think in the 1910s, one black police officer. There were 4 black sheriff's deputies in Vanport, but I have to tell you, they were hired specifically to police the black areas. That's why they were hired. One of them who came out became a very active person. His name was Matt Dishman. You might be familiar with a certain community center that was named after him or renamed after him. So Vanport brought a different kind of a spirit. A lot of the activism in Vanport was from black people. Dr. Unthank came there. Reverend J.J. Clow came there. In fact, he wrote letters protesting certain things that were going on in Vanport. And so that was the spirit. And because of the segregation, black people in Vanport formed a very close community that still exists with the hundreds who are still alive from Vanport. And they created there what I call the Vanport Spirit, living together, cooperating. Vanport, by the way, was a microcosm of the U.S. There are people from every single one of the 48 states. And so it was like a mini U.S. right there. And the black people there and later the college students became the nucleus of this spirit of working together, getting together, being patriotic. Now, in May of 1948, the Columbia River, beginning in British Columbia and down to Astoria, flooded. Sometimes people call it the Vanport Flood. It's the Columbia Flood of 1948. What the flood did, by this time, by the way, there were about 18,700 people in Vanport. And what the flood did was, it pushed people out of Vanport. And they went from being federal residents in an apartment complex to being citizens in Portland, which meant they could vote. And so they pushed this Vanport spirit out into Portland. The next chapter. In the 1940s and 50s, with black people established in Portland, there were renewed efforts going to the legislature in order to bring about changes. And in 1948, there was also a change in Portland. Mayor Riley was booted out. His successor, Dorothy McCullough Lee, lasted for one term. I guess she was too good. She was a reformer, but she was too good. But there was one unfortunate thing about this, and that is that one of the people who had come to Portland, Willie Mae Young Hart, had come to work in Swan Island, and after the war was over, she and her husband opened a cab company called the Beacon Cab Company. They had 2 cabs. Those cabs, by the way, were among the many vehicles who came and offered their service to ferry people out of Vanport into other parts of the city. She and her husband opened their home to Vanport survivors as well. Unfortunately, they did something that was deemed to be illegal. They transferred people out of Portland into the surrounding area where there were nightclubs. And Mayor Lee was against nightclubs. And so she found an old 1948 law that said you could stop cabs from doing that. So their cab company closed down, and Mrs. Hart then fell back on her old profession, which was as a nurse. But she also was a member of the NAACP. And so she became very active there. Another important thing coming out of Vanport is that the increased number of people and the increasing prejudice brought another organization out. There was a tour in 1944, I think, of the National Urban League, and a chapter was opened in Portland. Edwin Bill Berry came, and he was a very, very important person in terms of pushing against injustices, especially the injustice of people in Vanport who had lost everything, and the federal government refused to pay for it. And so they took the federal government to court, unfortunately, not successful. But it was another instance of activism. And so we now come to the early 1950s, and another key part in the Oregon story is that a man named Mark Hatfield, who had graduated college, joined the military, fought in the war, came back, and he ran for office. He became a representative down in Salem. Later, he became a senator in Salem. But while he was there as a representative, he was contacted by a couple that is really instrumental in this story, Otto and Verdell Rutherford, whose home became basically the NAACP office, and they combined with the Urban League and several other groups, met with this maverick, and they again pushed a bill that had been initially introduced in 1913 called the Public Accommodations Act. There were a number of times when blacks coming to Portland could not stay in hotels. The public accommodation law in Portland, by the way, was passed, and then it was referred to the people of Portland, who quickly voted it down. So this new bill, and it's not new, as I said, it goes back to 1913, it comes up again and again, 17 times in 60 years. Talk about persistence. This bill went through the Senate, and there was a thought that there would be a difficult time in the House. But Mark Hatfield is credited with really shepherding it in through the House, and it passed both houses, signed by the governor, and in 1953, Oregon passes the Public Accommodations Act. This, you will note, is a year before Brown versus the Board of Education. It's 11 years before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Oregon was ahead of the curve. But please note, who put Oregon ahead of the curve? a group of black people and black organizations, a group of white people and white organizations working together to make Oregon a little bit more like the ideal of the United States. And so there's so many people and so many events in the history of Oregon. And since you're here in this space, you should know that the Experience Oregon will tell you part of the story, as I have told you just one part of the story. So I would like to say a couple of other things as I come toward a close, one of which is that we've had a number of really very important people pushing for rights in Oregon. Senator Jackie Winters of Salem, who died recently, she came out of Vanport, by the way, and when I spoke with her last year, she talked about the Vanport Spirit of working with people, working together, and promoting each other. Currently, we have in Portland Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, Police Chief Daniela Outlaw, very recently Fire Chief Sarah Boone, and if you've ever been to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, there's a new director, a black woman named Nataki Garrett. I mentioned that simply to show that there has been a change in Oregon since the 1940s, that the space is now available for people to move up. And as Reverend King said, we become a place where people are judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And so the background I've given you leads to that. Black people were systematically denied rights, fought courageously for those rights, but not just for black people, for all people. Because when you deny a person of color an opportunity to move up, you're denying quite a bit more. There's a man named Robert Ford. He came out of Baltimore. He was a teacher. He came out of Baltimore to Oregon, but he found that he could make much more money working in the shipyards. So he worked in the shipyards. After the war, he applied for and he became the first black teacher in the city of Portland. Last year, at an event for the Vanport Mosaic, I was conversing with a few people, and there were 3 white people. When they heard me mention Robert Ford, they came over and they said, he was my teacher. He also became the first elementary teacher, first black high school teacher. He taught at Roosevelt, and they said, he was the best teacher we ever had, because the atmosphere had changed. And now people could rise up depending on their strengths and not on their color. And that's, I think, an important part of the Oregon story. In 1937, along the same lines, in 1937, Adam Clayton Powell, who, by the way, was my representative in Congress when I lived in Harlem, very interesting man, he began a campaign called Don't Buy Where You Can't Work. This was during the Depression, and a lot of stores on the main street in Harlem, 125th Street, did not hire black people. Or if they did, they fired them because of the Depression. And over a period of 2 years, he was very successful in getting more black people jobs in Harlem, and also, again, something that happened before Montgomery, getting black bus drivers whose routes went through Harlem. He was asked by a reporter, so, do you think all Negroes should join this campaign? His response, I'm paraphrasing, oh, no, no, no. I think that all justice-loving Americans should join this campaign. He took it a little bit higher. Reverend King, after the Montgomery movement was successful, gave a talk in which he told the congregation, this is not a victory for Negroes in Montgomery. He said, don't make it that small. This is not a victory for Negroes in the United States. It is a victory for all freedom-loving people all over the world. He took it a little bit higher. And I believe that the people that I've spoken with you about have taken it higher as well and are still doing that. So let me ask you a question. I'm going to come to an end very soon. But let me ask you a question. Actually, I'll ask you a question in a second. One more story. In the 1840s, there was a man who became the first superintendent of school in the United States. His name was Horace Mann. He grew up as a poor kid. He went to public school, public libraries. He was elected to the General Court, which is the legislature in Massachusetts. And he sponsored a bill to create a Department of Education to improve the education of students in Massachusetts. His friends thought it was wonderful. And then he was elected to a seat in the U.S. Congress, and they thought, okay, you're going to go on to bigger and better things. Then he resigned that seat because they could not find anyone to take over as Secretary of Education. So he resigned that seat, and he became the Secretary of Education, and he wrote reports every year. If you've seen Little House on the Prairie, that's sort of like 3 times what I went to in South Carolina. He's one of those who devised the fact that we need to have separate classrooms for separate kids, that we need to have books provided free education, not a new idea. And he later went on to head a school in Ohio called Oberlin. First school to have no requirement in terms of ethnicity or gender. And each year he gave a speech. In 1859, his last speech. Now, he did not know it was going to be his last speech. But his last speech, he said to the graduates, in ending, and this was part of Oberlin's mission, if you will, he said, be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity. So we started with 2 minutes of silence. At this point, we'll take about 30 seconds of silence. I want you to think, what victory have you won for humanity? And you have. You just need to think about it. 30 seconds. To what extent are you a bricklayer? To what extent are you a university builder? I believe that those that I've spoken about were university builders. They saw beyond themselves, and they made a change for Oregon. Oregon would not be what it is today were it not for some of those folks. Thank you very much. Conclusion. It's really dangerous to have a teacher as a speaker. There will not be a test, but there is an assignment. You have a 2-part assignment. At this point, I can strike a match and have doom, 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 for those of you who know it. Your mission, should you decide to accept it. Number 1, tell 3 people who are not here tonight some of what you have learned. Number 2, bring 3 people to experience Oregon. Thank you very much. I'm open for questions.
Let me grab a microphone so everyone can hear your question.
I just want to make a statement. I just want to say that my mother was a survivor of the Vanport flood. And she's still living.
What's her name?
Myrtle Carr. Myrtle Carr. Okay, she worked with E. Shelton Hill at the Urban League.
I could tell you a quick story about the Urban League. Personal story. When I first got here, I was working at Grant High School, a federal program called Minority Career Education Program for young blacks, getting them into industries and so forth. And it went on, but it was not a very good program. And so we were all given pink slips at the end of the year. And so I went to the Urban League because I heard, if you need a job, go and check out the Urban League and so forth. So I went there, and I remember recounting my story. I said, yeah, I used to work at Grant High School, but, and there was an opening, by the way, for a social studies teacher, but they wanted me to do something that I declined to do. I had to be a coach. And I thought, I'm not a coach, I'm a teacher. But if you're not a coach, you can't get the job. And so I related this to the Urban League, and I can't remember who it was that I spoke with, but I do recall he slammed his hand down and said, that damn public school, they keep asking us for blacks to be teachers, and you were there? The next day, I got a call from the school district. It said that, oh, Cleveland High School is rebalancing its classes and it needs a teacher. I thought, okay, thank you. Then I got a call from Cleveland High School. Could you come in tomorrow to interview? And I said yes. And I will tell you something. As I hung up the phone, I said to myself, I've got this job. And I said that because I believe that the Urban League had said to them, basically, you come to us and then you fire someone that you had. And so I went in, I went through the interview, and it's a curious thing when you go into an interview and you think that you already have the job, you can be very relaxed. And I was very relaxed. And they asked me to come back next week and start. So the Urban League to me is very, very important. As I said, the past is not really too far. But it's Vanport that led to the Urban League that eventually led to my being hired with public schools. Thank you very much for that comment.
I have a question for you about segregation. I live near Chapman Elementary School, and I've heard a neighborhood myth story that for Guilds Lake, that the school there was out of commission or was built late, and that Chapman used to have 2 shifts at Chapman School, that there would be white children that would go in the mornings, and then the black children would go in the evenings when their parents were working the swing shift. Is that consistent with what you know about that history, and do you know of anything similar in the Vanport area?
I don't know about that, about Giles Lake. I do know that Giles Lake itself did not have schools, and so the children went to the public schools. In the same way that Vanport did not have high schools, and so the high school age children went to Jefferson, Roosevelt, or Commerce, which became Cleveland. But I haven't, that's something for me to think about. I haven't heard of that.
Good evening. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here with us. When you look at, when you look at when you go back in time and look at all of the research have you taken into consideration why Portland is the way it is today because of systemic and institutional racism? Because if you look across the United States and you look at a lot of cities in this country, you look at today, for example, there are a lot of qualified African American, Asians, Latinos, Hispanic across this country who are experienced, well educated. They're just not afforded the same opportunities. You know, there's not a level playing field. There's never have been a level playing field. And so I'm just wondering the reason why Portland, historically, the way it is today, have you looked at some of the root causes like systemic and institutional racism? Because if you really look at that, that could be a reason why there is a low rate of participation or a low rate of you know, ethnicity here. My late father used to say one of the greatest things about diversity is diversity in ideas, diversity in thought. If you and I have the same opinion, we just have the same opinion, but if I have a different opinion and we can add value that way, that's a great thing. It's like a salad. The lettuce is great, but you add the tomatoes, the croutons, the olives, the salad dressing. That's what makes the salad great, not just the lettuce. So I'm just curious, have you really looked at systemic and institutional undercurrents as to why Portland may be the way it is today?
I think the answer to your question, again, is historical. Again, in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, up to the 1970s, there was systemic racism. It's being chipped away. We're not at Valhalla, but we're closer than we were 30 years ago. And I think part of it, the reason I mention those folks moving up in positions is, for example, with Joanne Hardesty, she was the one who chose the new fire chief. And so when people get into positions of power, they have an opportunity to make changes and to make Portland look more like a multi-ethnic city, which it is becoming. I should have said that in the 1940s, black people supplanted Asians as the largest ethnic group in Portland and Oregon. But I could also say by the year 2000, Latinos, Hispanics, had supplanted blacks as the largest ethnic group. And so there are changes coming, but as you mentioned, that systemic racism is there. I was a member of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality in Harlem, and when we went on marches, we talked with people, and we said, you know, a lot of people have to die before we have changes. We didn't mean that we needed to do something. We meant that they had to die off. And hopefully their ideas die off as well. But when people are promoted to higher positions, they have an opportunity to look, as you mentioned, at people. And by the way, I do not like the term qualified people. I remember in the 1970s with affirmative action, that term was thrown out. And I'm thinking, why would you hire someone who's not qualified? But it was always put as if, well, if they're qualified, of course they're qualified. And that's a fact. But you have to have someone of the mindset to say, I'm going to deliberately do something like this. In other words, promote people to get that diversity. And you're absolutely right. Diversity is important because you have different ideas coming out from different people. And sometimes the ethnicity doesn't count for that. You can be of one ethnicity, but still have a different mindset. But there's a possibility. But as people of color move a little bit further up in government and in business, there's an opportunity to hire folks. And someone like Robert Ford, I think is really important because those three students, I don't know what their attitude was before they had him, but after they had him, to say, he's the best teacher we've ever had, that change, I hope, goes down to their children and their grandchildren. And so we begin to have a sea change as well in attitude.
I was having a conversation with a friend last weekend, and I was reading her something of what I'd learned about how late we were in ratifying the amendments, and how it was you would get 30 lashes if you were black. You could not be a citizen, and that we had the largest Ku Klux Klan west of the Mississippi. And her comment to me was, well, they were mostly anti-Catholic. Could you give me a little history of the Ku Klux Klan and what you understand about its power?
A little bit, yes. The strongest Ku Klux Klan, by the way, in Portland was in Tillamook County. And you're absolutely right. It was predominantly against Catholics. But when you read the story, you find that the people who are fighting hardest against it are people like Mrs. Kennedy. And it's really interesting that there's so many mythologies around, for example, that the head of the National Welfare Rights Organization is a black woman. Whites make the majority of people on welfare. But the ones who are fighting it most are very concerned people for everyone. With affirmative action, by the way, the face that you see are black people. And there's a misunderstanding. I think maybe lately we can sort of pull the curtain back of the young ladies down in California who could not row but got scholarships. I had a student, a young white kid, at Benton High School. He was a senior. He was in my class. He wasn't doing very well. But he was a good wrestler. And at the end of the week, he came to me and said, "Mr. Harrison, did I pass?" Well, normally you don't say that because they'll get it. But he looked so desperate. I said, "You got a D." He ran at me, grabbed me, and hugged me and said, "Thank you." He had less than a C average, and he got into the University of Oregon because he was a great wrestler. We don't hear too much about that. And there are more legacy people and sports people who get in than black people. But we don't hear about that. But you're absolutely correct that the Klan tried to kill the parochial school system, by the way, in Oregon, by passing a law that you could not wear a habit, actually that you could not go to a non-public school. But that was fought up to the Supreme Court, and the Klan-based measure failed. But yeah, the Klan was mostly against Catholics in Oregon.
I seem to remember that the Oregon Constitution had a provision that blacks could not live in Oregon, but I don't remember when it was finally taken out of the Oregon Constitution and what impact you think that had.
I think it was in 1957. And the impact that it had, my political science teacher said, law is in its enforcement. There was a law that said blacks can't come after it became a state. It discouraged a lot of folks, but it was never truly enforced. I believe there was one person who was subject to the last law, and that's because he ran a successful store in competition to a white person who said he shouldn't be here. But the law, I think, acted more to discourage people than to keep people from coming. But again, 1957 is when it's finally thrown out. 1927, I believe, even though the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment said that blacks could vote, in Oregon, that was still there. It was a non-starter, but it was still there.
Thanks. I know the story well of how the black community of Albina was destroyed and replaced with I-5, I-405, Legacy Emmanuel, the, what do you call it, the Memorial Coliseum. But I bet you have some stories about how those displaced people rebuilt their lives and added to the Portland legacy.
I'm not sure if I have stories about that, but yeah, one of the things I believe about people of color in Oregon is resilience. A lot of anger, but also resilience. And I'm currently reading a book about an autobiography of Pauli Murray, who many people have never heard of. You've probably heard of Thurgood Marshall and Brown versus Board of Education, but behind that is a 5-foot woman named Pauli Murray. And one of the things that she learned very early in life, she was born in North Carolina, is don't get angry, get smart. And I think what happened with a lot of people in Portland, there was a tremendous amount of anger, but there was also a tremendous amount of, okay, how do we go beyond that? I think if Dr. Unthank had simply been an angry black person, he would have had less influence than if he was a concerned and smart and getting into the club from which he could have an influence. There are some people, one of the things this is off topic, but one of the books I love is about education. It's got an apple on the cover with an arrow through it. And I tell my students, rather than opposing institutions, get in there and destroy it from the inside. And I think that's one of the things that Dr. Unthank did. Rather than railing against the City Club, he got in, and then he used his influence there. So resilience, I believe, is an important part of it. Anger, yes, but then you have to do something else.
These days, one occasionally hears people say, who think about these issues, that one of the greatest obstacles to undoing the historical tragedy is economic. If you look at the distribution of wealth among families, black, white, colored, black families are so far down on the average compared with whites and even some communities of coloreds. Do we need now to think more about how do we offset the steady rise of wealth into fewer and fewer hands, and the circumstance of people at the bottom of the economic level having less mobility, less ways, more frozen into that economic stratus. And that economic stratus includes too many black people. Should we be thinking about this significantly as an overall economic problem and not just thinking about it in terms of race and trying to get away from a tragic history of race? Is this a time to think about seeing black people more and more as part of an economic class rather than a racial group? I guess is another way to overstate it.
Okay, I'd say both. It's a long, long history, and it brings up a lot of complications. But let me give you one example. In creating wealth, for example, the Social Security Act eliminated a whole bunch of whites and a lot more blacks. If you were a maid, as my mother was, or if you're a farmer, as my father was, you were not covered by Social Security until the 1950s. In 1944, the U.S. government passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. If you're a soldier, you come home, you get money for college, start a business, buy a house. 2% of the blacks were able to make it through that. You buy a house for $10,000, and 20 years later, it's worth $400,000. You pass that on to your kids. You don't get into that $10,000 house, you remain at that level. Now, how do you address that? There is something in Congress right now called reparations, and a lot of people just, oh no! When I taught U.S. history and black history, one of the things that I told my students is, somebody's got to hurt. I wish the hurt had been between 1866 and 1876. If people had hurt then, we'd be hurting less now. But it's literally kicking it down the road to say, oh, I wasn't responsible. And the answer is yes, you're not. But coming back to your comment about systemic, we have things built in that mitigate towards some people and against others. And until that changes, and if I sound like AOC, I don't mean to, or maybe I do. I have yet to read this book that came about 2 years ago that links capitalism and slavery and poverty. And that is a fact. It's not a theory, it's a fact. And the wealthy are able to make the laws in order to maintain wealth. And when someone says, oh, let's make some changes, it's always, oh, I'm not responsible. I didn't live 100 years ago. No, but you're benefiting from 100 years ago. And some people are good enough to say, you know what? We need to make change. But, so it's not, is it a black problem or is it an economic problem? I would say it's an American problem. And the solution is something that will raise all Americans up. When I went to college in New York, I went to Hunter College. I was telling my wife the other day, the most I ever paid in one term was $200. And $100 of it was for books. We had something called no tuition in New York City. The Republican governor, a man named Rockefeller, who was governor from the time I was in high school through college, persuaded the legislature, why should New York City have free education? And my thinking is, why didn't the folks in upstate say, hey, we want that? Rather than, they shouldn't have it. We should all benefit. And now there's talk of free college education, and it's like, oh, my goodness, can we do that? Well, we're not Germany, we're not France. They can do it, why can't we do it? So it takes a mind shift change, and it's also going to cost wealthy people, super wealthy people, $2 to do something like that. And put that way, it seems like, well, why not? I'm not sure if that answers it, but that's my response.
James Stanley Harrison for office. No. Thank you all so much for being with us this evening. Please do remember to tell 3 people something new you learned tonight. I've been thinking about my new thing, and please do bring 3 people to the exhibit and then let us know what you think of it. Follow us on social media, sign up for our email list, come back for more of our public programs, and a huge, huge thank you very much for your wonderful talk this evening.